This is like teaching cats to line dance, guys. Well, Patricia, you need to sit. And Alan needs to sit. Shall I point you out? The laggards? And Lee, come on. Some of them, don't know all of them in the back. Well, some of them I know. All right, now that you've had a wonderful opportunity to have a great snack, and you had a marvelous beginning to this afternoon, let me introduce you to this other part of the afternoon session. I'm Arlene Levy, and as you've heard, I'm sort of the big mouth in the corner. When I started and learned about Olmsted, I had blonde hair. So that was a few years ago. And having spent 4 years on a campus that was Olmsted designed, where, as a historian, Olmsted was never mentioned in my education, I didn't learn about him until graduate school, which happened to be converging at a time when the Park Service was taking over Fairstead, and the park advocacy was beginning. At that point, the National Association for Olmsted Park came together, and the folks from Seattle, if they're here still, yes, well, the National Association for Olmsted Parks came about. Among the people at the very, very, very first pre-meeting was Walter Hundley, who was your park commissioner. And even though it was a JCO park and we were all about Olmsted Senior, that is part of the force that brought together the energy to create this organization, which has survived for all of these years and is now spearheading this celebration. I have a wonderful task. It's a marvelous session you're about to hear. So let me introduce our speakers. And Dennis, are you first? Yes. Okay. Dennis Montagna is at the National Park Service, leading the Monument Research and Preservation Program based in the Philadelphia office. The program provides assistance in interpretation and preservation of memorials and memorial landscapes, good for that second part, to the NPS partners and park units. He holds a master's in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a PhD from the University of Delaware. His doctoral dissertation examined Ulysses S. Grant Memorial as a focal point for the commemorative landscape designed in Washington for the ceremonial part of the, originally for the Macmillan Commission and after, and something Patricia knows very well as being part of that park. And Dennis will be speaking about Tower Grove Gardens. Sorry. Bach Tower Gardens. I get my Tower Grove in St. Louis mixed up, but that's all right. Those from St. Louis understand my confusion. Tim Davis who will be speaking about the Olmsted Brothers 1918 report in DC's Rock Creek Park, America's first national park general management plan. He is a National Park Service historian based in DC. He received his undergraduate degree from Harvard and a PhD from the University of Texas in Austin. He specializes in cultural landscape history and has worked for HABS, the Historic American Building Survey, Historic American Engineering Record, Historic American Landscape Survey, and Park Historic Structures and Cultural Landscape Program. He's the author of National Park Roads, A Legacy in the American Landscape, and a co-editor of America's National Park Roads and Parkways, drawings from HABS and Hare. And I must say, the books and other writings that he's published are marvelous if you are like me and research in various areas. He's a very lucid writer. I welcome them both to the podium.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Arlene, and thank you to the organizers of the conference. I'm really glad to be here. I'm the real newbie in terms of Olmsted studies, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to come, is because I wanted to be able to have time to talk with all of you and to help sort of push my own research forward. I'm an art historian by training, and as Arlene said, specifically looked at monumental and memorial spaces. So Bok Tower seemed to be, it's both a monumental and a memorial space. So I thought, well, this would be a good thing to take a look at. Let's see, good, great. All right. From the time of its dedication in 1929, Bok Tower, a carillon near Lake Wales, Florida, has been a primary destination for residents and visitors to the state. As an object, the tower is hard to ignore. The Gothic Revival carillon is built of pink marble from Georgia and fossil-laden coquina stone quarried near St. Augustine. Placed atop Iron Mountain, one of the highest points in the state, it greets visitors long before they actually reach it. The tower is the primary ornament of the Mountain Lake Sanctuary, created at the behest of Edward W. Bok, former editor of the Ladies' Home Journal, the flagship publication of Philadelphia's Curtis Publishing Company. Bok had purchased the land for the sanctuary in 1922 and engaged Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and his firm to design its landscape. A look at the sanctuary's history reveals that this project grew directly from Olmsted's work on the design of residential communities, and that it was the product of a shared vision between client and designer, centered on the benefits that people derive from immersion in well-crafted natural spaces. It also suggests that the sanctuary has been able to grow and change over the past century while still reflecting the intent of its patron and designers. During the 19-teens and 20s, much of Florida's real estate development took place along the state's two coastlines. The extension, The extension of Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway to Palm Beach in 1894 and then on to Miami 2 years later led to a burst of hotel and home construction for both middle-class and wealthy winter residents. In 1914, international harvesters James Deering chose a Biscayne Bay site in Miami for Villa Vizcaya, his Mediterranean revival home and formal gardens. In Sarasota on the Gulf Coast, entrepreneur John Ringling built his Venetian Gothic-inspired mansion in 1926. A short distance south in Fort Myers, Thomas Edison had built a much more modest home in the late 1880s. Henry Ford became his next-door neighbor in 1916. Lesser-known developments of homes and citrus groves took place among the spring-fed lakes of the state's interior, south of Ocala. Travel guides of the period took note. John T. Ferris's Seeing the Sunny South of 1921 devotes a chapter to Florida's central interior. He wrote, "It is a mistake to think that when the East Coast and the West Coast of Florida are seen, the state has yielded its secrets. The higher lands of the interior, the backbone of the state, as these are called, repay attention. It isn't changing. Here we go. Frank Parker Stockbridge and John Holliday Perry's Florida in the Making, published in 1926, also turned readers' eyes away from the state's two coasts and toward the area they termed the Florida Midlands. Quote, a land of level plains alternating the rolling hills, sprinkled with freshwater lakes, covered for the greater part with pine forests and citrus groves, liberally dotted with charming and rapidly growing towns and agricultural developments, and furnishing winter homes and playgrounds for a multitude of people for whom the seacoast has no irresistible lure. Mountain Lake Colony near Lake Wales was one of these inland developments. It encompassed more than 2,800 acres and featured a hotel, winter homes, a golf course and clubhouse, and citrus groves. Land developer Frederick S. Ruth engaged Olmsted Brothers at the inception of the project in 1914. Ruth had lived in Baltimore's Olmsted-planned Roland Park, so he was very much aware of the firm's experience with residential developments of this kind. Reporting back to Ruth after his first visit to Mountain Lake in 1914, Olmsted noted the monotony of the unrelieved rows of orange trees already under cultivation there. But he wrote that with careful planning and preservation of land still occupied by native pines and other tall trees, and through, quote, painstaking adjustment of the orange groves and of the roads to the naturally picturesque and irregular forms of the ground, it will be possible to create a district exceptional for its beauty as well as for its productiveness, and attractive to seekers of winter homes in Florida who want the very best. Over the next 2 decades, Olmsted Brothers provided the landscape design for Ruth's development projects writ large, but the firm also designed for owners of individual properties. By the late 1930s, they had worked on more than 120 residential projects at Mountain Lake Colony. Many of these were relatively modest landscape designs that accompanied equally modest cottages, like that carried out for George Babcock. Others were much more formal. The sketch plan created for Conrad Hubert in 1920 features 2 main approaches, with one of them leading through an orange grove before reaching the home's circular forecourt. A lawn bordered by a hedge extends southeastward to a garden folly. In both plans, Olmsted kept the rigid orange grove subservient to the softer overall plan. Edward Bach first became an Olmsted client in 1921, when the firm began planning the landscape for the winter home that he was about to build at Mountain Lake. Working with the model of the house that architect E.M. Parsons provided, Olmsted first advised his client on the building's placement on the lot. As with other home sites at Mountain Lake, existing pine trees, oaks, and palmetto stands were preserved and augmented by the introduction of other plant materials. Within a year of building his winter home, Bach had also purchased 61 acres on the adjacent Iron Mountain for the construction of his Mountain Lake sanctuary. The site is picked out in green on the plan. It was a short climb from Bach's new home, and it had become a favorite haunt for him. Olmsted had observed Iron Mountain on his first visit to Lake Wales in 1914. He noted at the time, "I was first inclined to smile at the idea of calling a hill about 300 feet high Iron Mountain. It seemed a sort of Floridian joke upon the prevailing flatness of the rest of the state." The landscape Olmsted designed there in the early 1920s featured a broad assortment of flowering trees and shrubs, camellias, magnolias, and azaleas, reflected in the water features he introduced. All of it is seen against a rich green background with palms, ferns, pines, and oaks predominating. To provide food and cover as an enticement to migrating birds, he introduced bushes of edible berries, among them blueberries, gallberries, and Suriname cherries. And I show you the Suriname cherries because they're sort of unfamiliar to people who are not Floridians. So I thought, well, let me show you these. I remember these on my grandparents' property in Miami as a kid, and we ate them. They weren't particularly good, but we ate them because we could, so. Work on the sanctuary began in earnest by 1923, with site grading, trenching, the delivery of topsoil, and consideration of plant materials, but it is likely that the project had been percolating in Bach's mind for several years. In the Americanization of Edward Bach, the autobiography he published in 1920, and for which he won a Pulitzer Prize, Bach provided veiled notice of his intent to create a naturalistic landscape for the benefit of visitors and wildlife. Bach's narrative of his family's emigration from the Netherlands in 1869 and the development of his career in publishing begins with the story of his grandfather's efforts in the early 19th century to enhance the landscape of Texel Island, one of a string of barrier islands in the North Sea. At the opening of his narrative, Bach called Texel a grim place, barren of tree or living green of any kind. He wrote that his forebear was determined to beautify the island, planting 100 trees the first year, replacing ones that didn't survive, and continuing to nurture the landscape for 50 years by continuously introducing shrubs and other plantings. Bach wrote that once his grandfather's new trees had matured, quote, birds came and rested in their leafy shelter, unquote, and that over time the growing population of songbirds drew visitors from the mainland and ornithologists from around the world. Whether Bach's story of his ancestors' role at Texel Island is true, apocryphal, or somewhere in between, it serves as the evocative origin tale that underpins his own efforts to create the Mountain Lake Sanctuary in Central Florida, and he wanted the story to be widely known. Not only did he begin his autobiography with an accounting of the tale, but 2 years later, in 1922, he repackaged it as the first chapter of his book, Two Persons, an Incident and an Epilogue, a slim publication that concludes with a romantic, capital R, reflection on the landscape he and Olmsted had just begun to plan. In the epilogue, he wrote that he felt restored by his visits to the summit of Florida's Iron Mountain. He also wrote of his admiration for Olmsted and his work, quoting, "So it became the sanctuary, and the grandson called to the man, Olmsted, who loved the land, and said to him, 'Here are these acres on the mountaintop, already beautiful by God's hand. Complete them as you will. No one shall suggest, no one shall hinder or obstruct. Let your talent express itself to the full.'" See, when I said romantic, capital R, I wasn't kidding. Make it the most beautiful spot on earth where the birds and the human can rest and find themselves. Writing about the project in 1929, a few months after the formal dedication of the sanctuary and tower, Bach looked back on its gestation, writing, "It is nothing short of a marvel when it is remembered that 6 years ago, when the work of irrigating and planting was begun, it was simply a barren sandhill with nothing to help the landscape architect except the 200 or 300 native pine trees and its eminence as the highest spot of land in Florida." Bach had very little time to enjoy his creation. In January 1930, less than a year after the sanctuary's formal dedication, he died and was buried at the base of its Carillon Tower. That he chose to be interred there, at the heart of the landscape he and Olmsted created, rather than at the Bach family lot in Philadelphia's Laurel Hill Cemetery, suggests his satisfaction with the project's outcome. The Carillon Tower that became Bach's grave memorial was the work of a team of artists, designers, and craftspeople, nearly all drawn from the Philadelphia area. Architect Milton Madari designed the tower and coordinated a creative team that provided an ornamental program that further expressed Bach's desire to create a peaceful, restorative place for the enjoyment of visitors and visiting songbirds. Lee Laurie designed a sculptural program that features stylized representations of birds, plants, and mankind supporting the natural world through activities that include feeding cranes and flamingos and watering a garden. Clay models for these panels are shown at the bottom right. Above is a marble frieze of intertwined flamingos. The ceramic tile work that forms the Carillon's floor and the open lattice work that encloses its bell chamber is the work of J.H. Dulles Allen, chief designer at the Enfield Pottery and Tile Works based in Enfield, Pennsylvania. As with the work Laurie carried out, his representations present a harmonious balance between the worlds of plants and animals. In his workshop in West Philadelphia, metalworker Samuel Yellen designed and fabricated the tower's wrought iron interior elements and the metal gates at the two bridges that cross the moat that surrounds it. He also created brass panels that cover the tower's front door and present scenes from the book of Genesis. Even the contractors who built the tower, Horace Burrell and his son Edward, came from Philadelphia to direct the 2-year construction project. The Carillon's music-making apparatus was no less impressive. Cast in England and installed in 1928, the Carillon's 60 bells ranged in size from 11 pounds to nearly 12 tons and were able to cover nearly 5 octaves. While the Olmsted designed landscape was taking shape in the 1920s, but before the tower appeared, authors of books promoting Florida's growth took note of the work. In 1926, Stockbridge and Perry's Florida in the Making, quoted earlier, noted the creation of Mountain Lake Sanctuary, still in its early stages. They observed the goings-on at the top of Iron Mountain, quote, where original forest is preserved in its wild state and every variety of bird known to Florida finds unmolested nesting and resting place. In 1938, 12 years later, the same two writers returned to Mountain Lake Sanctuary as they prepared their new book, So This Is Florida. But by this time, it was the tower rather than the landscape that captivated them. They effused. There is one spot in Florida to which all others generously and sincerely yield homage. That is Lake Wales and its Bach Singing Tower. The monument which the late Edward Bach raised on the summit of Iron Mountain is the central milestone from which all distances in southern and central Florida are measured. Throughout the season from November to April, highways are crowded with tourists making pilgrimages to see the tower itself, possibly America's most beautiful structure, and to listen to the heart-lifting, soul-stirring music of its bells. During the middle years of the 20th century, the tower's fame seemed to eclipse the design landscape that surrounded it. However, if we take stock of the legacy of Edward Bach's Mountain Lake Sanctuary now, as it nears its centennial, we find that in recent decades, its leaders have been able to develop a more prominent niche for the design landscape. Likely aided by the growth of garden visitation and the environmental movement in the last quarter of the 20th century, the site became a National Historic Landmark in 1993 and has now been rebranded as Bach Tower Gardens. It has also seen the development of additional managed acreage well beyond that which Bach and Olmsted had first planned. Actually, it's about doubled what they originally planned. Indeed, change was always an expected element of the site's design. Writing about the garden's development in 1992, then Director of Horticulture David M. Price noted that Bach and Olmsted had been well aware that the landscape would be a living, changing thing. He wrote, "The gardens began as a sunny garden and have matured to a woodland garden. Therefore, some of the original plant types can no longer be grown here. This transformation was planned by Olmsted, for he understood the eventual evolution of the shade tree canopy." New programming places front and center both the landscape and its Carillon Tower. During the early months of 2022, the gardens hosted events that included outdoor yoga sessions, themed garden walks, and lectures on integrating healthy herbs into cooking. All of these activities are in keeping with the restorative and contemplative uses that Bach and Olmsted had imagined for this space. Carillon concerts continue to be a major focus at Bach Tower Gardens, as they have been since 1929, but now with a broadened repertoire that includes new compositions, regional and international Carillon festivals, and the creation of audio content that listeners can access virtually. Through YouTube, one can listen to the Bach Carillonneurs rendition of Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. It's quite a delightful 6 minutes. You should definitely tap into that. I thought about trying to include it, but it wasn't enough time. The site also serves as an outdoor concert venue, helping to introduce new audiences to the landscape and its mission. The legacy of Olmsted's work with Edward Bach goes beyond the landscapes created for his home at Mountain Lake Colony and at the Hilltop Mountain Lake Sanctuary. Olmsted also helped Bach to plan another land preservation project, one he called Tessel Jungle, about 11 miles south of Mountain Lake. You can see it there with, I've indicated in the little box up top, that's Mountain Lake within Bach Tower. Then if you work down, that other large block has this Tessel Jungle area. Centered on Tiger Creek between Lake Leonore and Lake Walk on the Water, and you can see Lake Leonore at the bottom left, and then Lake Walk on the Water on the right with the two blue arrows. And then there's Tiger Creek that meanders and links both of those. Bach named Tessel Jungle after the Dutch island that his grandfather had transformed. In early 1925, while landscape work up at Mountain Lake Sanctuary was in full swing, Bach asked Olmsted and a team under his direction to visit the Tessel Jungle area and report back with recommendations for the purchase of land and the setting of project boundaries. Olmsted responded with an illustrated 11-page report that addressed Bach's desire to preserve the jungle for public visitation and then emphasized the establishment of trails, picnic grounds at the ends of those trails, and parking at key locations. A follow-up aerial survey led Olmsted to suggest that Tessel Jungle should encompass about 4,300 acres. He also encouraged Bach to acquire enough land to protect the jungle from undesirable residential development. He cautioned his client to guard against, quote, ugly and tawdry houses or shabby and slatternly use of the land on the high sandhills overlooking the jungle, warning against also speculative low-grade real estate development on the shores of Lake Leonore. But within a matter of months, Bach had shelved his Texel Jungle project. He wrote to Olmsted that he was abandoning the effort because he was unable to ensure that roads would not be cut through the reservation, and because he feared commercialization of the land that surrounded it. He later confided to Olmsted that he was irritated, quote, at the constant evidence of selfish interest taking advantage of an idealistic proposition. Bach's aborted effort to preserve Tiger Creek and its surroundings were forgotten until Mountain Lake Sanctuary Director Ken Morrison found references to the Texel Jungle project among Bach's papers in 1966 and launched an effort to secure the needed land, which, despite Bach's fears, had changed remarkably little in the 40 years since he had targeted it for preservation. By 1971, the Nature Conservancy began acquiring the needed land. Today, Tiger Creek Preserve covers nearly 5,000 acres and is home to a variety of plant, animal, and insect life. Much as Bach and Olmsted had envisioned, the landscape has been only minimally manipulated and provides day hikers with more than 10 miles of trails to explore. As we consider the legacy of Bach and Olmsted's work in Central Florida, the preservation of archival resources looms large. The preserved record stands at the heart of the 1960s rediscovery of Bach's efforts to preserve Tiger Creek in 1925, and it inspired the plan's successful rebirth nearly a half-century after it was first conceived. Digital versions of hundreds of photographs, postcards, letters, and other primary documents are now accessible via the Bach Tower Garden website, encouraging people to make their own discoveries about the site and its past. The institution has also added new collections to its holdings. A few years ago, the descendants of the Carillon's builders, Howard and Edward Burrell, donated the company's journals and photographs that document the tower's 2 years of construction. These materials then served as the focus for the 2018 traveling exhibit called Creating an Icon, The Way We Worked on the Singing Tower. By providing online access to digitized archival materials, institutions like Bach Tower Gardens and the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site have enabled historians to continue their research during the pandemic years when physical archives and libraries have remained closed. But in the long term, this kind of institutional commitment to digitization and open access will facilitate and should help to democratize primary research that has traditionally required a significant amount of travel time and financial wherewithal. Providing greater access to more of the historical record will also encourage the work of historians who are asking questions beyond those that primarily involve the aesthetic desires of clients and the designers they engage. It will help us to better explore the complex social and labor histories of residential developments like Mountain Lake Colony and public spaces like Bach Sanctuary. We'll learn about the lives and work of the legions of stonecutters, masons, steel fabricators, nurserymen, and work crews who labored to create and sustain these places, but have remained largely invisible. Also yet to be examined to a significant degree are the audiences for these places. Who was welcomed, who was not, and what mechanisms were put in place to structure the uses of these spaces. Olmsted Brothers drawings that detail the segregated toilet facilities they designed for Mountain Lake Sanctuary in 1928 invite questions such as these. Finally, along with increased access to traditional archives, we need to look to indigenous people, like members of Florida's Seminole and Miccosukee tribes, who likely possess knowledge and perspectives not available anywhere else. While forming a truly complete view of the past is likely beyond anyone's grasp, pursuing these and other lines of inquiry will lead us to a much fuller understanding of a complex history. And I want to offer one thank you to Michelle Clark, who's an archivist at the Olmsted site, who sort of opened up the world of the archives at Olmsted to me and continues to send me things. I just got some 1949 planting plans from her the other day. So, you know, it was nice getting started in this project, and it's people like Michelle that keep pushing you forward to be doing more. So anyway, I want to send a thank you to her too. So anyway, thanks very much.
Hey, thanks. I really want to thank Debbie and Jay and everybody else who in this really exhaustive, extended process of putting this together. I want to thank for the gracious introduction. And I want to apologize for ending up with another academic talk. But if you stay awake, you're going to be rewarded with alcohol and heavy hors d'oeuvres. So we'll see how that goes. The Olmsted Brothers' 1918 report on Rock Creek Park has attracted scant notice from national park scholars or Olmsted aficionados. Not only has Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. dominated the historical discourse, at least until recently, we've seen even today a bunch more about Olmsted Jr., or Little Ricky, as I like to call him, and JC. But Rock Creek's status as a national park is often disregarded, though its 1890 authorization coincided with the first major expansion of the national park system, in which Yosemite, Sequoia, and General Grant also received official designation. As with these better-known examples, Congress stipulated that the underlying purpose was to create, in the classic language, a public park and pleasure ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people of the United States. The Olmsted Brothers report was intended to ensure that Rock Creek Park would fulfill this lofty ambition. While its recommendations were imperfectly realized, today's managers continue to evoke the Olmsted Brothers report in their efforts to adapt the 19th century reservation to 21st century concerns. Along with its role in shaping the development of Rock Creek Park, the Olmsted Brothers report has broader significance as the earliest comprehensive master plan for the development of a national park. Park-wide master plans did not become integral aspects of NPS policy until the mid-1920s. Prior to then, most national park improvements were just piecemeal as individual projects, which is the case in Rock Creek Park as well. The park's 1890 authorization celebrated its scenic qualities, but the engineers responsible for its upkeep focused on developing roads to accommodate the visiting public. Portions of the 1918 report did address circulation concerns, but its comprehensive scope and division of the park into landscape-based administrative units presaged the official master park planning process, while its detailed assessment of, I should have had that up earlier, portions of it gets into assessing and defining plant communities and their treatment in ways that weren't done for decades. So Rock Creek Park, for those who don't know it, we're all about Boston today. We had a few excursions. Is located in the northwest quadrant of Washington, D.C., and encompasses about 1,700 acres of woodlands, recreation areas, assorted visitor administration facilities, roads. And in the 9-mile stretch between the Potomac waterfront and District of Columbia, the creek cleaves through this rocky strata of the Piedmont region to create an attractively varied valley that ranges from picturesque rocky ravines in the north to gently sloping woodlands, actually kind of farther north and in various parts in between. The movement to create a park along Rock Creek began in earnest after the Civil War, at the time when the region was mostly woodlands and small farms containing a few small mill seats and some country roads. Despite the limited access and private ownership, the area served as a de facto public park where local residents enjoyed its shady groves and bucolic drives. Olmsted Sr. made numerous excursions along the creek while working for the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War and extolled its value for potential park development. Concerns that development would engulf Washington's natural environs, together with the growing sentiment that no major city, much less the nation's capital, could be considered complete without a first-rate public park, generated a series of proposals for a park along Rock Creek, including an elaborately detailed 1867 plan submitted by Major Nathaniel Mitchler of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on your left, and an even more elaborate and ambitious and totally unrealistic 1883 proposal. These ran up against overambitious landscape acreage requirements, and also the reluctance of Congress to fund what they considered unnecessary amenities for the District of Columbia residents. By the late 1880s, continued growth along Washington's northwest suburbs and increasing concern about development created another boom of interest in park creation, and following another blitz of promotion, Rock Creek Park was finally authorized in 1890. Improvement and maintenance was entrusted to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and who were instructed to proceed as soon as possible to lay out and prepare roadways and bridle paths to be used by the driving and horseback riding public and footways for pedestrians. And they were told to develop guidelines and regulations for the preservation from injury and spoliation of all timber, animals, or curiosities within said park, and their retention in their natural condition as nearly as possible. The comprehensive guidelines would have to await the Olmsted brothers' report, but the commission set about, the Army Corps of Engineers, set about building roads, constructing some amenities. Their most well-known was Captain Beach, an Army Corps of Engineer who created or improved and expanded Beach Drive, and a number of attractive rustic bridges were built along the park. In 1901, oops, wrong direction, the prestigious Senate Park Commission weighed in on the development of Rock Creek Park. While the more prominent members of the so-called Macmillan Commission focused on the city's monumental core, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was the principal author of the park-oriented sections of the report. Olmsted expressed concern about the Army Corps' construction of Beach Drive, contending that there were sections where it would very appreciably injure the scenery. And I think he's talking about, you can see the sort of harsh excavations on the right side there, where they tried to fit this widened road along the creek. Olmsted acknowledged that the value of the park scenery depended upon its being accessible to the people, but cautioned that nothing can be gained if the means of access destroys the scenery which is meant to exhibit. His biggest concern was that the growing popularity of Beach Drive would accommodate the demand for increased access would further damage scenery along Rock Creek. So he suggested building drives along the edges of the park, high enough on the valley to leave the wild sylvan character of the streams of the bottom gorge uninjured. He acknowledged neither approach was ideal, but declared it would be these drives on the side of the valley would be a pound of, or to take it from the Beach Drive along the creek would be a pound of flesh from the heart of the creek, from the heart of the park, while the former would be compared to the amputation of a leg. The Commission's other main concern was that improvements within the park were being produced in a piecemeal fashion, with no evidence of a comprehensive plan. Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. was a firm believer in the value of comprehensive management plans based on detailed studies of a park's natural features and intended uses, even at this age. So the Senate Park Commission report, AKA Olmsted, said, after completion of its present width of road along the creek, we would advise most urgently that no further work of development be attempted until careful studies have been made for the comprehensive treatment of the whole park. I mean, that may have been job security, but it was also heartfelt. And what you saw was a number of these piecemeal improvements that created a lot of friction. Finally, in May, 1970, the Rock Creek Board of Control engaged the Olmsted brothers to develop what it termed a general plan for the development and maintenance of Rock Creek Park. A preliminary report was produced in September 1917, and the final version was completed in 1918. Apparently, Olmsted actually lost the plans during that period and kind of held things up. The report included a series of plans, 15 black and white photos, several pen and ink sketches with the Reptonian flaps, and Olmsted Brothers was the official author. As you probably know, J.C. was in failing health. Frederick Law Olmsted, he had developed extensive familiarity with Rock Creek, and authored those sections of the report, the Senate Park Commission report. A lot of the actual work, the detailed work, was done by Edward Whiting, who joined the firm in 1905. Arlene and I disagree a little bit about authorship. I mean, it's clear that Whiting really wrote most of the report, but it really is, in my mind, fleshing out Olmsted's ideas that he articulated. But it's also totally clear that Whiting was the guy on the ground, schlepping around, taking photos, doing the drafts. So, as we were saying, Whiting doesn't get enough credit, but I think you can still call it an Olmsted report. He was certainly supervising it in the end. And also this insistence that the key to park planning lay in the identification and enhancement of broadly defined landscape units, together with the emphasis on forestry work, owed a strong debt to Charles Eliot's work in the metropolitan reservations. I mean, maybe more so than your classic senior Olmsted's finite plan. Olmsted was following more in this model of identifying and developing guidelines to follow through. And there's repeated sections of the report where he says again and again, where we're not presenting detailed plans, where we're creating guidelines for management. I want to move on to talk a little bit about emphasize the relationship also with the National Park Service. Olmsted report, whoever wrote it, certainly begins by stating the dominant consideration never to be subordinated to any other purpose in dealing with Rock Creek Park is the permanent preservation of its wonderful natural beauty and the making of that beauty accessible to people without spoiling the scenery in the process. Now, as many of you can see in Language and in Spirit, this echoes the key phrase of the 1916 Act authorizing the National Park Service, which, again, you probably know, is to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in a manner and by such means as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. And again, as you probably know, Olmsted Jr. more or less authored that part of the Park Service's Organic Act, although Horace Albright later claims to have done a lot more than he gets credit for. So again, just trying to emphasize, we haven't talked much about the Park Service, but trying to emphasize that connection. And he talks about the tension between a lot of the report and a lot of Olmsted's work, reconciling this tension between preservation and access, between preserving the beauties of the creek and the forests and meadowlands, and making accessible the providing for the recreational use of the landscape, and also to further emphasize the Park Service connections. Anybody recognize the gentleman on the bottom left? It may be hard to see. It's St. Stephen, Stephen Mather. So he's riding in 1916, right as he's creating the National Park Service, he's riding through Rock Creek Park, being driven because he was a man of means. Again, I just want to emphasize this connection, which I think has been overlooked. The report presented a three-part strategy. Here's another example of the, these are actually the Reptonian overlays, which unfortunately, and I was going to talk about this later, but it's a good time. And I think it actually came up in an earlier paper. There was different administrations and different individuals. These plans get lost. The report itself gets lost. At one point, the park managers are several points. They're like contacting the Olmsted brothers to say, could you give us another copy of the report, or we've lost. These things disappeared from the government by the 20s. And they've never been seen. But again, the brilliance and incredible value of these online archives is demonstrated in what we've been able to turn up. And again, I probably shouldn't go into huge detail here, but it identifies different regions of the park, first in a kind of a very broad brush approach. He talks about different landscape massings, forest massings, topography. I think these might be the bottoms of the overlays. I'm not quite sure the way they show up. Then gets down to a more nitty-gritty detail again, all in like picturesque landscape language. But then he goes on to talk very much in planning terms, also talks a lot about, just as in the Olmsted part of the Senate Park Commission, the need to rectify years and years of neglect, of these farmlands growing up, of these overgrown weedy forests. So in both the drawings and in these photographs, they're documenting the need to clear up and to do. Again, we learned about the judicious use of the axe to restore these vistas and create new ones. And then, again, this very plannerly approach, and yes, Whiting is doing the work on the ground. And here's a preliminary sketch, another, of dividing the park first up into these administrative units and based on perceived needs and how they relate to topography. I'm not going to go into detail, but first there's the creek, which is, they talk about being the backbone of the park. That's A in the middle. And again, I had never seen these until I looked at the archives, because we just have in our records just these really bland, poor 1920s reproductions, and we didn't have any of the photographs. Then on the upper east side, middle east side of the park, there was already a reservoir, so they talk about, they provide plans for developing that into more intensive use, and that was more or less partially built. Then just a little bit farther north, the next section C, what becomes the golf course, is more rolling and open, and they talk about how that's a unique opportunity because there's not a lot of rolling, open terrain in in Rock Creek Park. Then that's the golf coursey one. But this is really interesting because he had these grand visions for the sea area of the park, which at the time was still a mix of woodlands and forests, and he wanted to develop it as kind of open woodlands with paths, a place for, he talks about people disinclined to do the rugged northern part of the park. He wanted to have seats and all sorts of paths through it and maintain an open landscape, and that never happens. It just completely grows up. And then you get the open rolling part that becomes the golf course. And then up north, you get the wild part of the park, above Military Road, which is still the primary road across the park, and talks about how we should maintain this wild character. And then finally, at the very northern end of the park, apparently at that time, there were these open meadows. And they said, let's develop this, and it's another unique area. We could make a self-contained greens ward, keep it open. Again, that gets totally grown up by the 1930s, and there's no hint of this idea of a different. Rock Creek Park now is mostly woods, aside from the golf course. And then there's this whole next level of very intensive, I won't go into the details, very intensive forestry planning, broken up into half a dozen different categories with recommendations about maintenance. This report is very much about saying park design, park creation and management is an ongoing process of a continual adjustment to circumstances. It's not that, boom, here's Franklin Park, do it. This is Olmsted Jr. And the kind of the master plan process. But this is an incredibly intricate thing that, again, I would say Whiting probably did, undoubtedly was 99% responsible for this intensive forestry development plan. And then they talk about, again, this challenge of balancing preservation and access. The public wants to get into the park. And Olmsted, and this, he articulates this in the Macmillan Commission report. His idea is more drives, but narrower ones. So he proposes this kind of insanely, we would think today, overdeveloped road system. But you have to remember at that time, carriage roads, we talked about that earlier, the automobile's just kind of showing up. How do you deal with it? And the carriage road was not as destructive to the scenery, and there was also the idea that the more circuitous you made it, the bigger your park seemed. So there was virtue to that. And then the idea that you move traffic, you spread out the damage to reduce danger to Rock Creek and Beach Drive. And they also proposed this elaborate one-way drive system, which is very interesting for the time. And then there's a lot of concern about utilitarian traffic. I mean, in a way, Rock Creek's lucky because it's radial, so crosstown traffic really isn't all that much of an issue, but they do propose these two viaducts over Rock Creek Park, which would have been, again, we look at them and think, oh my God. But there was a lot of precedent for this in the Washington area. The Connecticut Avenue Bridge had just been completed and was a huge draw in and of itself. The Cabin John Bridge, the biggest masonry arch in the world, was also a tourist draw. So this wasn't as crazy at the time as we see it now. And then they talk about rectifying the boundaries because the original park had a bunch of holes due to land acquisition issues. So they go through and they say, we need to get this back and this back and this back. Then what happens, as with many reports, what happens to the report? Right away, actually, as they're doing it, Rock Creek Park gets absorbed into the park system of the District of Columbia. And so it's the Office of Public Buildings and Public Grounds that's taking care of it, and the Commission of Fine Arts. And there's a couple of great quotes. Again, we don't have time to get into them of, this is a fantastic park. It should be a Bible that everybody should read and keep with them and memorize it. It should not end up in some dusty files. Well, it ends up in the dusty files, but it keeps coming out. So every 10 years or so, like in the 1920s, there's this great quote from where Ulysses S. Grant III, he's at that point the district commissioner, and he writes, Olmsted saying, gee, I'd never heard of this. Can you guys send me the report and the plans? Because it sounds like a good thing that I ought to know about. And then the same thing happens when the Park Service takes over. That's one of the first Park Service map, where the Park Service, Tommy Vint, and a couple landscape architects, and Meineke, the forest guy, they actually bring Olmsted down and go through with him. And he's kind of like, oh my God, because everything had grown up. He says, we're going to give up on that northern meadow. We're going to give up on that. And why didn't you ever get rid of the dead trees and all the growth? And then the Park Service guys say, there's a lot of value to this report, but as you might expect, they're saying the automobile stuff, maybe not so much. And again, there's talk about, now the automobile is the greatest danger to the park. Especially after Rock Creek Parkway on the bottom gets finished, it's kind of an almost expressway up to the bottom of the park. And the idea of people sitting on park benches watching the traffic go by is, but ironically, in the 30s and 40s, Olmsted himself, there's all these traffic studies about how this is where traffic wants to go, actually into the 50s. Traffic wants to go out of DC into the burbs. And Olmsted supports the idea of this drive along the side of the park, this US 240. And that's interesting. But, he is the utilitarian planner, city planner, looking at the bigger picture, trying to figure out what's going to work. And it may seem awful, but it's also part of his this heartfelt desire. We got to do whatever it takes to not screw up Rock Creek and Olmsted at this point is, he's getting elderly. When the Beltway becomes a fait accompli, they actually hire the Olmsted Brothers firm to kind of do window dressing on what was called supposedly going to be the Beltline Parkway. So Whiting actually, it's going to be 2 lanes and pretty and windy. That's still where the most accidents happen. It does slow people down where it goes through Rock Creek. And Olmsted actually does write in from Palos Verdes and says, I don't think we should have anything to do with this. I really, he was actually at that point full circle again, once again, firmly against the idea of a major road. And just to finish up, so of course, the latest, actually really the first real official general management plan and environmental impact statement was finished in 2005. Instead of 9 months, it took 10 years and runs to like 800 pages. But they do, in fact, invoke the classic lines from the Olmsted Brothers report. It gets invoked again and again. There was a recent effort by the cultural landscape architects to try to restore some of the vistas. There's, in the 1980 report, there's all these vistas identified. So there's this kind of ambiguous legacy. It really does, I think, for the first time with a national park, get into this broader planning kind of idea. So it's significant that way, even if nobody in the Park Service really knows about it, except in Rock Creek Park. And Rock Creek Park's history has been mixed. They keep invoking it. It's great language. It's like the Park Service Organic Act. But the follow-through, and now, there's a lot of concerns about equity and access, and some of the planners are very much invoking Olmsted to try to eliminate automobile traffic. But that's a serious equity issue because for a very long time, the black community has been driving into the picnic grounds and using them, and they're not on $10,000 carbon fiber bikes. So it's different audiences.
Thank you very much. A lot of food for thought there, and a lot of whoops, sorry. I have a loud voice, I forget I have to be available or heard. Anyway, a lot of food for thought and a lot of controversies and a really complicated, Rock Creek is such a complicated landscape. Is it a park with a roadway or a roadway in a park or roadways in a park with all these cultural attributes you don't even pay attention to because you're whizzing by them too quickly? And then where's Maryland in this whole process? Because you end up in Maryland if you don't realize where you are. So are there any questions? I hope so. I hope we've generated some.
Thank you. I'm Greg DeVries. This is a question for Dennis, and it's about a lot of the topics that we've been discussing have been about the Olmsteds and public landscapes, but yours is somewhat different, although it's intended for the public. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and the client, Bach, and it seemed like you indicated that he gave complete artistic license that Bach did to Olmsted, and I'm wondering is that nuanced at all, and particularly in terms of going forward in the landscape as an evolving element.
Yeah, well, one of the things I think, in looking at Bach, what you have to understand is he was a marketer. He was a publisher. He was a publisher. He was he loved and advertising was the thing he loved the most about the publishing business. So throughout, I get a really strong sense that he's really trying to construct a story that's going to continue on beyond him, and I think that his publication where he's talking about Bach and being given given Olmsted free hand. I think some of that was true. It was true. There was a lot of conversation that went on between the two of them, and a lot of times Olmsted would find himself in the position of having to throw a little cold water on Bach's suggestions for someone who wasn't going to be suggesting. There was a lot of suggestion. He had to tamp down the notion of this is the highest point in the state of Florida. And so Olmsted said, well, I think we can say it's the highest point in the peninsula. But if you go out to Tallahassee on the Panhandle, and also the number of trees planted. And Bach very gently, Olmsted very gently said to him, well, no, it's not that many trees, because if it was that many trees and shrubs, they'd be about 6 inches apart. So he was. You can tell he was just, but he was trying to kind of nuance this client. The Bach family remained clients of Olmsted's for a very long time. The firm worked at the sanctuary well into the 1950s. They were still designing and working on these lands. The last photo I showed that had the Seminole Indians pose, that was the parking lot, was originally designed as part of that. It's a huge parking lot, and the Olmsted brothers designed that as part, because they were really, it was that notion of this was a public space and that people were going to be chauffeured there too. I think, and I haven't gone into enough yet, but I think the bathrooms for black people, I think it was largely geared at chauffeurs. And I don't have that, but but it feels like it, but I don't have the piece of paper for it yet. But anyway, yeah, there was a long-standing relationship that continued after Bach died with the Bach family. Mrs. Bach was considerably younger, and they worked a lot up in Camden, Maine, the Curtis Publishing, the Curtis projects up in Camden, as well as in Pennsylvania, a number of different, and some housing developments that the family was involved in. So there was a long-term relationship that I think continues to some extent to this day. Duck Pond up in Maine, and some other projects. So yeah, I think it's going to take looking more into, really delving into the archives, which, as I said, is eminently doable now. I can sit in my basement and do it. That's the thing that really blew me away the most about being able to work on these projects and the increased accessibility. So, yeah.
Actually, and including the cemetery that you showed. Besides Bach, the cemetery in Pennsylvania was designed by the firm, or that plot,
Yeah,
those plots.
Olmsted did a planting plan for the Bach family. It was a Bach family lot in the cemetery, and that was news. I didn't realize that until I started looking at this stuff. But having the photographs, as Tim was saying, having the accessibility of the photographs that maybe have not survived in other archives is really a great thing.
I just like to clarify something, that this argument or discussion I've had with Tim over Edward Clark Whiting, it's not so much that we want Whiting to be there. We want to understand whose hidden hands were in this process. But Whiting would never have thought of himself as Whiting designing it. He would have thought of himself as under the rubric of the Olmsteds, and he is the last member of the original Olmsted brothers firm who survived, dies in 1962 when it becomes Olmsted Associates. But he keeps that longevity of design and the ethic going. But it's nice to know whose hands were there, at least for historians like me.
Yeah, and the hands in all those drawings are definitely Whiting's. He's having a hard time getting hold of Olmsted. Actually, kind of like his dad, at that exact time, he's working for the Defense Housing Corporation. I can't remember the technical name for it. So he's in Washington, probably staying at the Cosmos Club, having, dinner with all these people, and, covering relationships and things. And Whiting is sometimes like writing back to the firm saying, I can't get a hold of Mr. Olmsted. But he does make several walks through of the park with him. And again, I think a lot of it, how old was he in 1901, 1900, like 30?
30.
Yeah.
He was born in 70.
So that was this young, spry guy. That when he was running around the park, actually getting these ideas and seeing the problems. And I'm sure all the forestry problems were just much worse by 1917.
And what you should know, which you bring up, is the fact that when Rick Olmsted comes back to the firm after Senior really has lost it, and he comes to the firm to form Olmsted Brothers, and Elliot has died, he takes over that environmental planning that's happening for the MDC Metropolitan Park process, and it's really innovative. It's something that Anita Beresbiata at Harvard is now going to explore, I hope, once she has some time.
Yeah, you don't see those at all in the Park Service at that time, those landscape unit things, but it's totally precedented in the Elliott work for the park.
But I have a question for you, Tim, because you bring up the loss of this document, the disappearance of this document into various places. What can you, all of us here, but you within the Park Service, do to get a new copy of this? to get it republished, to get it reprinted so it's accessible?
Yeah, there's a dismal copy of it online. The Park Service has this e-tick digital library. You can barely read it, and the drawings aren't even there. There are drawings, but they're also, you can barely see half of them. So this is, and they're all the black and white things. I had no idea this stuff was like so beautiful. So, you know, it would be, and I think still today with our histories and with our other kinds of reports, just like it was Charles Moore who was cautioning about the fate of reports to end up in dusty shelves, and a lot of our stuff is online now, and I guess that's good. The newer stuff is all online. Now I kind of miss the hard copies. We don't do hard copies of things very much anymore.
Elliot, I think you had a...
Hello. I was just going to thank you for your talk, but also encourage you to re-upload your work to Irma and eTick so that the Tim Davis 30 years from now might be able to find it in a new dusty file. And if they have any initiative and encouragement, something new, something good can come out of it.
And we also, I mean, it's all of us doing work, you know, since the telephone came. Well, Park Service was really good up really into the 50s and even 60s. But the records now, it's so hard to get records. And we even have this whole, you know, official records. You've all taken the official records management training, right? Raise your hand. Nobody paid, you know. A prominent Park Service historical architect who will go unnamed, when he retired, there were just bins and bins and bins for weeks of paper going to recycling. It's, you know, we don't do a good job with our records.
Laura,
Is this on? Yes. I have a question for Dennis, and this is seeing if we can find a connection back to the National Park Service. And I'm wondering if you came across any evidence that Olmsted had consulted with natural history botanists in Florida. I'm thinking of David Fairchild at the Kampong, south of Miami, who were very important in the group that Olmsted assembled to do the reconnaissance of the Everglades, which was precedent-setting also for the National Park Service, making the case for a sort of the natural environment of what I'm going to call a non-heroic landscape, right? It's not glacier, it's not Yosemite, but that was really important. And it was clear to me in your discussion about that second sanctuary that he was very interested in the natural. So I just wondered if you had any.
Yeah, I haven't yet. I mean, again, my delving into the records has been pretty limited, but I haven't yet found that connection. But what I'm finding with the sanctuary is a lot of input from nurserymen and people working in South Florida. And there was a distinct attempt to really try to use as much planted material from South Florida as possible. Didn't always work out. And, you know, in a lot of the postcard views, you always see flamingos posed. The flamingos did not do very well there. And they really live in, they really live in through the postcards. They live via that. So it didn't always work out. There was a lot of trial and error. And I think Bach was very disappointed at the flamingo thing because he wanted to, you know. And also too, I mean, we had like later manipulations, but I think there was a lot of South Florida. There was a project in Miami that I haven't been able to take a look at yet. So I want to begin to look at some of the parks. They worked on Babson Park, which is a little further south. So, you know, there's a lot to be looked at there, I think. But it's you know, it's interesting. It gives me, having grown up in Florida, it gives a whole nother level of interest to that area. You know, so yeah, sure.
can I just add something to that? I will say he does consult David Fairchild, who at that point is at the Department of Agriculture, and he asked from David Fairchild to get lists of, this is when he's working in the residential area before he starts. He asks for lists of plant material that will survive and thrive in this Florida environment because they want to emphasize the subtropical nature and for beauty and aesthetics, as well as not quite all there to begin with. And the other component is they also go to what they're working on in California at the same time to look for plant material there that works.
There was also a lot of push and pull of trying to introduce from some South Carolina plantings and going sort of back and forth. Yeah. So yeah, there was a try, but and Bach would often write, "I want to keep this as Floridian as possible." Is that that was really sort of a key thing. But yeah, but Fairchild. I mean, for most of us who grew up in Florida, we had our class field trips to Fairchild Gardens. You know what I mean? So that was always a part of the sort of growing up process down there.
Are there any other questions? One more question. Where is the microphone?
I was really surprised when Tim said that the Rock Creek Park was transferred to the city of Washington, D.C. And I presume around 1918, 1920. And when did it go back to the National Park Service? And does the Park Service run the entire park system in Washington now?
Well, what happens is it doesn't technically go back to the city because there was really no city to go back to. It went to the Office of Public Buildings and Public Grounds. It kind of went from the Rock Creek Park Commission, which gets dissolved, to the Office of Public Buildings and Public Grounds, which is presided over by an engineer from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So they have it basically from 1917 until 1933, where with the reorganization of government bureaus, the Park Service takes over DC elements, most of the federal elements, the bigger elements of the DC park system. That's when they get the historical parks, and Mount Vernon Memorial Highway becomes part of George Washington Memorial Parkway. So it's, not technically DC, it's the Office of Public Buildings and Public Grounds. And then there's even at one point some more initials in there.
It's Record Group 42 is like our favorite record group down in D.C. And that's all the comes over from the War Department. And I mean, that's why in that group, it was interesting to hear about things that have gone amiss because the work I was looking at in the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, it's very complete. The Record Group 42 at the archives is really good, and in terms of preservation of photographs and other things too. So I wonder if there was some other things with this particular, because the stuff having to do with the mall seems to have survived better and is where you think it would be somehow. But
yeah, in my experience, it's pretty good too. So it was surprising to me, but it's great to hear these actual comments of like, where are the plans? What happened to the plans? Where are the photographs? Boy, I should have. Maybe that means they were actually out there. Somebody was dragging them around the park and trying to do something. Apparently, it didn't look like it though, because when they come back, and especially when he comes back, actually in '43, I believe, Vint and others bring him back, and it's like we can't even. He's saying like we're not even going to try to stave this one. Forget that idea. But we still need to clean up all the dead trees and the weedy trees. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I just have a few things. First, I would sincerely like to thank all of our presenters today and our moderators. Round of applause. Okay. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you don't already know, our reception is tonight, 6 to 8. It will be in the back corner around. You'll see they're setting it up now. There will be heavy hors d'oeuvres. There is a menu at the front desk if you want to see what we're serving. And there will be mixed drinks, beer and wine. Everybody has their 2 tickets, yes? Okay. Reminder to sign up for the field sessions if you have not already. And if you are wanting your ASLA professional development hours, please sign up for those too at the front desk. Tomorrow we will start at 9 again. And if you need a snack before the reception, there is still food in the break room. So thank you, and we'll see you tonight.
you.